This is lecture 3 for History 102. Where we left off, we were talking about the Indian Rights Movement, the horrible boarding schools, and the Dawes Act. Now, today we're going to cover the horrible massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890. But a couple things before we get started on that. There's a link in the mini lecture on the West to an essay written by Robert Bosch. And it's an excerpt from his book, Far as the Eye Can See. It's a very well-written essay that kind of sums up what happened to Native American people in the United States. I'd like you to read that. It's an important work. Now, in order to understand the massacre at Wounded Knee, which I call it a massacre, most people do. Previously, it was called a battle. As you'll notice on the map in your textbook in edition 17 on page 581, they just call it Wounded Knee. They don't want to call it a battle. They don't want to call it a massacre. Well, that's up to your authors. It's a massacre, as you'll see. And to understand how it came about, we need to explain what was happening to Native people in the late 1870s, in the 1880s that led up to this horrible event. The United States military systematically defeated the Plains Indians and all the other tribes west of the Mississippi River. One thing that lent to this tremendously was the destruction of the great buffalo herd that took place at the same time that we covered earlier in class, where they went from 15 million animals down to 1,000 or less. When they were gone, these Native people were helpless. So they were easily militarily defeated, rounded up, placed on reservations. Now, one thing that's going to happen and arise during this period of the 1870s and 1880s is a religion or a religious cult. And the name of this religion that swept through Native American tribes of the West was the Ghost Dance religion. Now, the Ghost Dance was created by a Paiute chief in Nevada who went out on a vision quest trying to seek answers to the problems that faced his tribe. A religious practice that is practiced by many Native American tribes. And on this vision quest, he believed that the spirits spoke to him. And what they showed him in these visions that he had was that the world was going to end. A horrible earthquake was going to destroy all life on Earth. But a few days after this horrible earthquake, all the Indian people would rise from the dead, and so would all the animals, including the buffalo. And things would restore back to what they were like before white men or Columbus arrived here on this continent. This was his belief. He shared it with many people, and it caught on like wildfire. And it became known as the Ghost Dance religion or cult. Now, a lot of Native American people started to believe in this, and when you think about it, when you're very desperate and the future is bleak, and your life is being destroyed around you, you're going to cling to anything that offers hope. This offered a great deal of hope to the Native American people because in this great vision known as the Ghost Dance, white people didn't rise from the dead, so things reverted back to the way they used to be. So, one person who is going to become a believer in the Ghost Dance is the great Lakota chief Sitting Bull. Now, by 1889, the Lakota people had surrendered to the United States government. They had returned from Canada, reached a treaty settlement, and they had a treaty that gave them lands as a reservation in present-day South Dakota. Now, Sitting Bull started to practice this religion, and he was such a great leader, a large number of the Lakota started following the thoughts of this religion also. And this is going to start the beginning of problems with the U.S. officials who were in charge of the reservation where the Lakota people, including Sitting Bull, resided. They saw this as a threat. And when you think about it from their perspective, there's nothing great about a religion in which everybody on the earth dies and you're not one of the groups that rise up from the dead. Only Native American people were. So it wasn't good news to the superintendent of the reservation. So he ordered that the ghost dance could no longer be practiced on the Lakota reservation. Now, he made this order in 1889. It becomes controversial. And in 1890, Sitting Bull basically defies the order and says, if I want to practice my religion, I'll practice my religion. Isn't there such a thing as the First Amendment and guarantees of religious freedoms and rights for everybody? If so, that includes Sitting Bull and his people. So he defied the authorities of the reservation administration. This is going to continue to brew into trouble. It's a struggle for power. And in the end run, what's going to happen here is the superintendent of the reservation is going to order the arrest of Sitting Bull. And at his disposal is a police force that's made up of Lakota Indians who are loyal to the government, and they're employed as police officers. They're going to go to Sitting Bull's house in the middle of the night. They're going to crash down the front door, barge in, and attempt to arrest him in his bed. Unfortunately, when they leave Sitting Bull's home, they'll be carrying out the body of a dead Sitting Bull. According to the accounts of the reservation police force, Sitting Bull pulled a weapon on them when he was woken up, and they shot him in self-defense. According to Sitting Bull's family, they shot him dead in his bed while he slept. It was a case of cold-blooded murder. What really happened inside that house, we'll never know. But the end result is, Sitting Bull is dead. Now, this really spooks his people. Because Sitting Bull, by this point in his life, he's a tribal elder. He's a wise sage. He also has had vision quests, and he's done religious ceremonies such as the sun dance and so forth. And one of his visions that he had about 3 or 4 years before his death was that he, the great Sitting Bull, was going to die at the hands of his own people. And sure enough, Lakota police officers who were Lakota Indians were the ones who shot Sitting Bull. So a lot of people are really disturbed by this. When Sitting Bull had first shared this vision with his people, they kind of thought he was getting old, senile, didn't know what he's talking about. Well, guess what? He predicted the future. So, after the people get over their mourning of the death of their great leader, Sitting Bull, what they decide to do is they're going to pack up everybody at the Lakota reservation who wants to go with them, and they're going to march north up into Canada. They'd done this before. They sought sanctuary after the Battle of Little Bighorn. Their idea was to go to Canada so they could freely practice their religion, namely the ghost dance. So they pack everything up. It's December of 1890, and they're marching to Canada. They're going to encamp one night in a dried out river gulch The river or the creek was Wounded Knee Creek. And in the middle of the winter, it's dry and it's a depression in the ground. It's a good place to camp because you're out of the wind. And they camped there on the night of December 28th, 1890. And when they wake up the morning of December 29th, 1890, they are quickly discovered by the 7th Cavalry Unit, Custer's old unit. Obviously, he's not in charge of it anymore, but the unit lived on, who had been sent to round them up and return them to the reservation for whatever reason. A lot of people question, why didn't they just let them go to Canada where they wanted to go? Why do you have to force them back to a reservation where they don't want to be in the first place? But that's a decision that was made. So, the troops all appear on the scene, heavily armed. In fact, they have Gatling guns mounted on the back of wagons, which are, early machine guns, and they surround the encampment of the Lakota. The first thing they do, standing up on the ridge of this gulch, is they order that everybody put their weapons in one big pile and prepare for a surrender. Once all the warriors had put their weapons in a pile, then some officers and other enlisted came down and started to do a cursory search of one warrior after another. They came upon one warrior who still had a knife in his belt and told him to go and throw it over on the pile with the rest of the weapons. The warrior refused. He tried to explain that that knife was not a weapon. It was the knife that his grandfather had given him. It was his grandfather's knife, and it was a sacred item to him, and he wasn't throwing it in a pile where it'd be lost forever. But he had no intentions of using it as a weapon either. This turned into a big argument. While the argument was going on, some of the women of the tribe started to perform a ceremony known as the actual ghost dance. There is a ceremony where especially the women, would dance in a circle, acting as if they're in a trance, like they were ghosts who had risen from the dead. It was part of this religious cult. This really spooked the soldiers. It's unclear what happened next, but it turned into a slaughter. They opened fire on these unarmed Indians from up above on the ridge of the gully, and much of the carnage was due to the fact they were using these Gatling guns or machine guns mounted on the back of wagons. When the smoke cleared, 150 of the Lakota are dead. Another 50 are wounded. A couple hundred of them were able to run away and flee down the Dry River Gulch, running for their lives. What will happen next, after all this confusion and carnage, a huge snowstorm will hit the area. Remember, it's December 29th, and it's South Dakota. The army will retreat, and in the process of what will happen over the next day or so due to this snow blizzard, another 100 Lakota people will freeze to death because they would have run for their lives. They have no blankets, no teepees, and then they try to shelter as best as possible in a blizzard. So all told, 250 Lakota were murdered either at the hands of the military or they froze to death, and another 50 were wounded. This was a massacre, not a battle. One side was unarmed, the other side was armed. That's a massacre. This is extremely important because this really is the end of any organized Indian resistance to the United States government for nearly 75 years. After this, all Native American people will sort of fall in line cooperate with the rules and regulations of the Dawes Act, get their little 160-acre plots of land, supposedly become small farmers, and sort of disappear into the woodwork. No longer does anybody fear being attacked by so-called renegade Indians when they travel out west after December of 1890. It's the end of an era. Native American people will not start standing up for their rights until the 1960s, when a group known as AIM, or the American Indian Movement, will form and start defending the rights of Native people and start celebrating their culture and reorganization of their tribes. And part of it is due to the fact that FDR will reestablish reservations in the 1930s. Another big factor that led to this rebirth of Indian people is many Native Americans went to college on scholarships, and many of them became attorneys. These attorneys started filing suits, making the United States government live up to the treaties that they had signed in the previous century. And judges made decision after decision backing the rights of Native American groups. That's why they're still around today, active, have reservations. Unfortunately or fortunately, one of their big businesses is casinos, but they're thriving once again, where there was a 75-year period where they basically sort of disappeared off the face of the earth. So, that's the end of our study of Native American history in the Gilded Age. Next time we'll talk about them is during the New Deal, when FDR reinstates the reservation system. So that's it for today. I'll be talking to you soon. I'm going to come back in tomorrow to the library here and record a couple more lectures. So you all take care, be safe, and stay home. Bye now.